And Krishna is saying, you must act. I will be there to support you, to bless you, to guide you, but you must act. Happy Labor Day weekend. Looks like people are out there in the sun a little bit today. I can't help but sort of chuckle at that name, Labor Day. It has a particular meaning to mothers who've given birth. Different kind of labor. I was given this quote recently by Winston Churchill. He said, let me see, I dislike the many virtues of that person. Wait a second, no, I'm going to say it right. He has all the virtues I dislike and none of the vices I admire. I thought that was a good one for ego, friend, or foe, because in fact, that is something we tend to do, and that's a big part of the story. In the Bhagavad Gita quote today, it talks about, all the bad qualities, well, not just in the quote, but in the whole Gita, how we are attached to those qualities. They've been a part of us, and we have a hard time giving them up. And so, ego, friend, or foe, as was talked about a little bit last week, we need the ego for a long time while we're trying to exercise the muscles of our positive qualities in this lifetime. We need self-discipline. We need the power, as the affirmation talked about today, the energy that it takes to lift our consciousness into cosmic consciousness, where it already resides, but we've allowed it to be clouded over by millions of lifetimes of karma, of actions, whether good or bad, they all covered us up. And so until we step on the spiritual path, we need that ego. But once we do step on the spiritual path, then the ego becomes our foe, because the ego, Yogananda defines as the soul identified with the body. And in other contexts, he also explains with the personality and all the likes and dislikes and predilections, billions of them. That's what the ego tries to do, limit us to those self-definitions. And in reality, we are none of those things. And so at a certain point, when we begin to get a taste of that and realize it, and we begin to have the sense of a blessing that we receive when we have some inkling of attunement with the divine, with the higher realities that are within us and all around us, and begin to see those and realize we want more of that, we are more of that. We want to merge more into that understanding and that experience, that vibration. When we realize that, then the ego becomes our foe, because it tries to limit us. And so, I was thinking about the beautiful quotations here from the poem Samadhi by Yogananda. He says at one point, where I in the cosmic sea watch the little ego floating in me. In other words, the individuality never dies, it remains, but once we're floating in the cosmic sea, we're the observer. And we see it like snowflakes, each having their own identity. That part of us never dies, but the greater reality of our being in cosmic consciousness becomes the reality and observes the little ego floating in us. In the reading this morning, and I brought it because I want to quote it exactly, he says at a certain point, and how the qualities must qualify. It's sort of a puzzling line. And in reflecting on it, I realized that in the Bhagavad Gita, of course, Krishna describes that we have many qualities, and we have 100 bad qualities, negative qualities, and only 5 good ones. I mean, that's symbolic too, because they bifurcate, right? They get, pride and arrogance, and there's all these subtle layers of it. But nevertheless, it's overwhelming when we try to sort of attack or work at the negative qualities, and the positive qualities are only 5. But then in the Gita, Krishna sides with Arjuna and the good qualities, the 5. But he says, first I want to say the good qualities win. And in my understanding, that means they qualify. That's how I choose to interpret that phrase, how the qualities must qualify. They qualify to enter into cosmic consciousness, into bliss. And so Arjuna has Krishna in his chariot, but Krishna says, I won't enter the battle. You must enter the battle. You must act. And Arjuna slumps and is hesitant to kill these qualities which have been a part of him for so long. And we think to ourselves, as Arjuna's, he represents the disciple, he represents you and me. We think to ourselves, can I just hang on to that one little thing? And that one little thing becomes the thing that holds us back from merging in God. So no, we don't get to hang on to it. And Krishna says, you must do battle. And so this quotation today is from the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And the 3rd chapter is about karma yoga. It's about action. And Krishna is saying, you must act. I will be there to support you, to bless you, to guide you, but you must act. And I was thinking, Swami Kriyananda, who's the direct disciple of Yogananda and Ananda's founder, I was blessed to spend many years with him, working closely with him. And the way you work closely with him is not to draw energy to yourself, but simply to serve and to listen, to be aware, and to try to tune in to the vibration. And so through all those years, I asked him maybe less than a handful of spiritual questions. And on one occasion, I was with him alone and I asked him a question. And he answered and he said, well, Master said this. And he laid out the answer for me. And he said, but you shouldn't just accept that at face value. You need to look at that from as many angles as you can and try to understand it and absorb it, act on it, experiment with it. Make sure you understand it from the inside and not just in two-dimensional words mentally, you know? And so an example of that in his life, in his autobiography, a very little incident seemingly, but he talked about when Yogananda had first asked him to lecture and speak publicly. And he had, Kriyananda had been studying the teachings on God as the doer, karma yoga, action without desire to the fruits of our actions. It's God working through us. And so he was giving this talk like this on a Sunday, and he decided to have God work through him, and so he just didn't say anything. And he waited for God to speak through him. He had his mouth partly opened, I would imagine, ready for God to speak, and nothing happened. For 2 minutes, he stood there in silence. I could do that right now, but you get a sense that 2 minutes can be a very long time in this context. And then finally he realized that he had to speak, but tune into God and have God speak through him in that way. And so God is the doer, but we have to act. And that's a very simple illustration of how that principle works. And he was testing it to experience it for himself. That's what the yogic path is all about, direct experience. Don't just listen to it. Don't just feel a resonance with it. Explore it within yourself. Practice it. Experience it. That's the beauty of the spiritual communities that we have. Because, as Swami Kriyananda used to call them, living laboratories of practicing these teachings. And that doesn't mean just meditating, or I shouldn't say just meditating, that's a big piece of it. But it means the interaction, the way our egos get to rub off against each other, to smooth ourselves, to refine the ego. And so we're practicing the teachings and experimenting with the philosophy so we can see how it works and why it works. It's a little bit like comprehension in reading when we're in school rather than simply reading the words. And then in the Bible quote, it says, "Blessed are the pure in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And the reading goes on to explain the story about Baduri, the saint who gave away all of his, quote, wealth, and so on. And it reminded me of a story from India about the son of Vyasa, who wrote the Bhagavad Gita. The son's name was Shukdeva. And when he was born, you could tell from the very beginning that he was an extremely highly evolved spiritual soul. So when he was just a young boy, Vyasa sent him off to a saintly king named King Janaka for study, to become his disciple. And Yogananda tells us in another context that King Janaka was, Lahiri Mahashaya was an incarnation, or King Janaka was an incarnation, I should say, of Lahiri Mahashaya, who's the one on your left, far left. Anyway, so Shukdeva took a few of his books, because he was going to go study with this guru, took a few of his books and he went to the palace. And it was an enormous palace. And he went inside and he was ushered in to see the king. The king was sitting on his bejeweled throne and smoking a pipe. And Shukdeva thought to himself inwardly, what is this? There's nothing but material opulence here, and he's sitting there smoking a pipe. This can't be my guru. But they started to have a conversation, and Shukdeva was asking him spiritual questions, and King Janaka was answering and asking Shukdeva questions about himself. And then suddenly the servant came in, ran in and said, "Sir, there's a big fire at the edge of the city. We have to leave the palace." And King Janaka said, "You go fight the fire, help fighting it. We're in conversation." And so they continued. And then a little bit later, this same servant came running in desperately, and he said, "Sir, the fire is at the edge of the palace. We have to escape now." And King Janaka said, "You go help the others fight the fire. We're in conversation." And then very quickly after that, the servant came running back in and he said, "Sir, the fire's right at the door of this hall. We have to run now." And King Janaka stood up, but Shukdeva held his books really close to him. And he started to run, and King Janaka waved his arm, and the entire fire disappeared. And then he said, "Shukdeva, you're more attached to those few little books than I am to this entire palace." And Shukdeva understood his folly in judging from the outside in rather than from the inside out what was really going on there. And then sometime later, I'm talking about weeks later, the king gave Shukdeva a test. He gave him a little bowl of oil, and it was filled all the way to the brim. And he said, "I want you to walk through every room in this palace without spilling one drop of oil." And Shukdeva took it, and he very calmly went walking through the palace. It took him about 2 hours to do it carefully without spilling a drop of oil. And then he got back to the king. The king said, "Very good." He said, "Now I want you to do the same thing, but I want you to look at every detail in every room and report it all back to me without spilling one drop of oil." And so Shukdeva did that, and this time it took him about 10 hours to do that. And he got back, and the king asked him details about each room. And Shukdeva passed the test. And the king explained that we need to learn how to walk in this world, noticing everything carefully, being conscious and aware, and yet not spilling one drop of our spiritual oil, of our inner life. That's the balance, is to learn to live in this world, but not of it. And it's no simple task to do it. You know, we're gonna spill some oil in the process for a while, but it is how we can walk through this life, giving, serving, completely connected to everyone and everything, and yet not attached, and not spilling one drop of our own inner devotion and spiritual life, of our oil. Yogananda said that this is not an age where we run off to monasteries and caves in order to live a spiritual life. This is an age where we embrace life and learn to live in this life, but not of it. And so that's where the ego becomes our friend and our foe, when we can transcend the ego so that we cannot be attached as we walk through life and a life of karma yoga, a life of service.
Thy will